Well, all right, my friends. Welcome to Trap TV. David Parsons here. I am calling this series Brick and Mortar. This is a place for me to talk about the construction of physical space throughout history and its interaction with ideology, psychology, and the way we live. As many of you know, I wrote a book about coffee houses, specifically politically radical, left wing, anti war coffee houses during the Vietnam War era. And ever since writing that book, honestly, and probably before as well, I've been obsessed with this sort of idea of the built environment and what it communicates to us and the kind of world it makes for us and where all that stuff comes from. So, a lot of what I'm thinking about, at least in this first episode here, is drawn from the work of Walter Benjamin. This is a person who I'm sure many of you have heard of before, but he was a German Jewish philosopher, cultural critic, essayist. He has a kind of tragic story of committing suicide on the run from Nazis in 1940. But before that happened, he was creating some of the most compelling theoretical work on capitalism and consumer culture that I think has ever been created, including the essay that I think probably got many of us started in. If you ever took a class in film or cultural theory, that essay called the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction is something that I think many undergrads encounter, and it's maybe a first like mind blowing sort of meta take, and an introduction to postmodernism and all sorts of things like that. But I want to think specifically about this project that he never completed, that he was in the midst of, called the Arcades Project. The Arcades Project was an unfinished project written between 1927 and 1940. This was just a gigantic collection of writings on the city life of Paris in the 19th century. Benjamin is writing in the 20th century, but he's writing about these specific spaces, these arcades, these kind of glass covered, almost like the proto shopping malls in Paris, where the middle class could stroll through this landscape of consumer goods. And it kind of gave birth to this idea of the shopper, or as Benjamin calls this figure, the flaneur, or the person who is sort of the pure subject of consumer capitalism that sort of walks and strolls and experiences the kaleidoscope of this kind of culture. So I found this really great piece in Real Life magazine, their December 29 issue, by a writer named Apurva Tadapalli. She wrote a great piece that I was looking for a connection between Benjamin's Arcades project and online culture. I've been thinking about that, and that's sort of where I'm going today. But this is a little bit, I want to read a little bit, two short paragraphs from her piece about the Arcades project and introducing that. So this is Apurva Tadapalli in Real Life magazine, and I have this article linked in the episode description here. Walter Benjamin wrote and compiled the text of what became the Arcades project based on a Paris that did not exist anymore. The arcades were the physical spaces where consumer culture in 19th century Paris was born. Shopping centers that took the form of street markets, narrow and winding, and housed all manner of transaction: cafes, repair shops, brothels, salons, restaurants, boutiques, theaters, gambling houses. Some were exclusively for the very wealthy, others replicated the street economy for the very poor, who now no longer had to fear oncoming carriages. Benjamin marveled at these inner boulevards, glass roofed, at the fact that people could now purchase even a sky full of sunlight or stars without having to also weather the elements. An arcade is a city, a world in miniature. Modern life was, according to Benjamin, itself a phantasmagoria, the dream state produced by capitalism. To reclaim our consciousness from this sedated state, something of a jolt would be required. The reform of consciousness consists solely in the awakening of the world from its dream about itself, he writes in the Arcades Project, quoting Marx. Benjamin considered himself a Marxist, and his contributions to Marxist literature and modern critiques of capitalism are incomparable. But what is perhaps most useful about Benjamin's vision of this dreamlike existence is that this reading does not infantilize the bewitched dreamer, the consumer, the way that some Marxist criticism does. For Benjamin, being awake or enlightened is not the point so much as the moment of awakening, the moment when the past's dream state and the present's wakeful state converge. This is the moment when meaning is spontaneously generated, when reality is illuminated, always only for the immediate present. Knowledge and meaning are not contingent on a structural historical event, revolution, but rather arrive in a constant stream of nows. So I really enjoyed that writing. And again, that piece is from Apoorva Tadapalli in Real Life magazine. And, that idea of the constant stream of nows, to me, that's a critical feature of capitalism's built environment. The idea of building places where you don't know what time it is. There is no future and no past. You're sort of suspended in this timeless place. That is the consumer. The goal of capitalism is to put the consumer into that kind of timeless place. And how that's achieved physically and how that's achieved technologically and through the construction of an environment is something that you can kind of see that the principle of the arcades at work everywhere you look. Once you read and understand what Benjamin is saying, you can see that in the modern shopping mall. Obviously, this sort of timeless place where even you're indoors, but the weather is kind of there. It also reminds me of maybe the most arcadey place in the world, and a place that I'm sure we'll get into on Brick and Mortar eventually is Las Vegas, which even has like the stars often painted on the roof as some sort of simulacra of a kind of the weather and being outside while you are in this environment that never ever changes. And as many of you probably know, Las Vegas, when you're inside those casinos, there are no windows. There's no notion of an outside world, and there's certainly no clocks. You can never know what time it is. It's always this timeless zone. So I think a shopping mall is trying to do that. And you can see those principles at work in the design of modern shopping malls. And we'll certainly think about malls on Brick and Mortar. Another place where I feel like this kind of repetitious loop of constant now through the homogeneity of the space is very much present in the suburbs, which are a kind of sedated arcade, right? If you've ever walked through a suburban neighborhood that looks like these ones that I'm showing you right now, the kind of effect it has on you. For me, these spaces were psychologically alienating in a lot of ways, in part because they're kind of half arcade and half not, right? They're like privatized spaces. These aren't shopping malls, but they sort of are built along those principles. And the suburbs as giant shopping malls or giant arcades is something worth thinking about, because they're like kind of cheap versions of those beautiful Paris arcades of the 19th century. But Benjamin is telling us that there's something deeper going on here. So yeah, the construction of these, especially those post-war suburbs, the suburbs that most Americans think of when they hear the word suburb, is the sort of post-war, post-World War II, 1950s vision of cultural conformity. No, we're not like that anymore. We tell ourselves. But I think one of the things that's important about the TV suburbs is the TV is there as well. And I think when we're thinking about arcades, Benjamin talked a lot about cinema. Benjamin didn't live long enough to talk about television or the internet, but his ghost haunts all those technologies because the arcade principle is there, right? When you look at like flipping channels, you're sort of flipping through this endless loop, this sort of timeless thing that never stops, right? It's infinite. You flip through those channels and you're kind of on this conveyor belt that always returns you back to the beginning. There is a timelessness to flipping channels, and I think to scrolling on the internet as well, that puts you into that very particular capitalist subject position that Benjamin is describing. And you can't get any more on the carousel than when you're thinking about the iPhone or social media on a smartphone. So Steve Jobs here in his evil turtleneck, smiling while he's holding up this phone and heralding the invention of something that he knows is powerful. In part because I think that the phone has sort of is a good example of how capitalism has harnessed this arcade's impulse and this need to sort of stare at a constant swirling infinite loop of images that never stops, that puts you into a position of timelessness that, if I'm being psychological here, I'm thinking about like the denial of death and the kind of putting yourself in a zone where you aren't on a linear you aren't on a linear sort of march towards death. I mean, in a way, and this is, I think, what's critical and something that Benjamin gets into. It's the irony is that you're sort of escaping capitalism, or at least the feeling that you're in that mode of like on a linear march towards an inevitable death, where you go to work every day and time is divided up in terms of morning shift, lunch, afternoon break, and then going home to your house and sleeping, and everything being regimented. The arcades sort of take you out of that, and the arcades put you into a timelessness. I think that's what's so freaky and scary and powerful about the internet being on your phone, because it gives you a place to escape time and to sort of go into this timeless loop where everything is constantly refreshing and new, and you don't have to think about being on that linear timeline, which is a little scary, right? So thank you, Steve Jobs, for being the instrument of capitalism, condensing the arcade's impulse down to a little device that we can carry with us, and maybe the absolute doom of humanity. We don't know where that's going. But I want to think about another place today in terms of brick and mortar. Another place that is a sort of condensed arcade, a place where you can really see the arcade principles and sort of mesmerizing qualities of the arcade at amusement parks. Specifically, I'm thinking about Disneyland and Disney parks and Walt Disney, who is probably one of the most dialectical creatures that ever lived. We'll get to him, and I want to think about Disneyland, but amusement parks in general, places that sort of condense the arcade. I mean, Main Street USA in the sort of entryway boulevard into Disneyland is literally fashioned after this European arcade, where you stroll through a space, and there's candy being sold and toy stores and places where you can go inside and make purchases. So the sort of timelessness of the shopper that's kind of being exposed to this endless stream of places where you can make purchases and transactions. And I would say even the sort of erotic exchanges, and we'll think about that element as we move through this. It's really, really powerful and important, and one that Disney knows very well and connects directly to their sort of whole experience. So amusement parks are a big subject, and I'll definitely return to the wider world of amusement parks and where they come from, and this sort of simulacra impulse to sort of like condense the world into a fake place where you're sort of out of time and out of the world. That's a really important principle of all these amusement parks. I just think Disney does it in a way that's very specific to the American experience, very specific to a vision of American society and American history that I think is worth paying some attention to, even though there are other big amusement parks where dinosaurs are coming out at you, all sorts of Marvel characters, etc. The amusement parks contain so much of what I want to get into on brick and mortar. So we will come back to the dinosaurs and Disney. But I want to think about these where the amusement park actually comes from. Like, what is this impulse? There are a lot of different strands of human culture that come together to create places like Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm or Universal Studios or Six Flags Great Adventure. One of them is these fairs that were occurring in Europe and in the Middle East during the 11th and 12th centuries, 13th centuries, the Middle Ages. You start to have these sort of temporary events in villages in which there is a gathering of people. And there's a lot of different purposes to this gathering. And I mentioned, erotic connection might be one of them, but also, there's entertainment. These are kind of like farmers markets where trades are being made. There's also property deals and legal things that are happening. There's also often woven into Christian and pagan religious traditions and rituals. So there's a lot going on, but these fairs develop over the centuries, and there's a few that are more famous than others. The Bartholomew Fair outside of London is one of the preeminent charter fairs of this era. That sort of means it's official and officially sanctioned by the monarchy. But this runs from 1133 to 1855 every year at the end of August. And this is a place that you really start to see the entertainment or spectacle element of people gathering in that sort of European culture of sideshows, prize fighters and boxing, musicians, wire walkers, acrobats, puppets, freaks, wild animals. This is sort of the heyday and the beginning of tarot cards and that culture. So, a real kind of the beginnings of like a circus and carnival culture. And you see these fairs eventually become, much more pronounced in how constructed they are as a built environment. And you get to see, a lot of the types of entertainment that's being constructed here. But this is a lot of, again, if you look at a deck of tarot cards, you get a sense of the type of imagery, the type of archetypal characters and clowns and puppets and witches that would have been present at these types of celebrations. But this is, in many ways, I can see the beginnings of like the arcade impulse here. The idea that you're going into a place that is outside of the drudgery of everyday work and instead experiencing this party and this party zone that's a space specifically meant to like arrest time and experience time in a different way. So you can see that impulse at this Bartholomew Fair becoming a much more constructed place. And eventually we're going to see this turn into a permanent impulse. So one of the things that catches my attention and makes me think about Benjamin the most, about thinking about these middle era European fairs, is the ubiquity of the carousel. The idea of the circle begins to stick out to me as having some sort of metaphorical quality. So I'm going to take a sip of coffee and think about that metaphor of the circle for a second as we look at an early carousel from the European era in the 12th century. So carousels emerged from early jousting traditions in Europe and the Middle East, in which knights would gallop in a circle while tossing balls from one another on their horses. This is an extremely dangerous activity that required an amount of athletic skill and dexterity. And that carousel, that vision, becomes more and more a spectacle over time. And over time at these events, you would see a kind of carousel turning away from its tradition as a kind of simulacra or practice for battle or war, and turn into a kind of parade or celebration. So the riders of these horses, the circle expands, and you have carousels that are moving in massive numbers around these giant circles. And some of these carousels at Louis XIV's, as you see here, the most famous carousel of this kind of parade notion is Louis XIV's in June 1662 in the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace to celebrate the birth of his son and heir. And that carousel, the site of this event is next to the Louvre, which you can see there. That carousel is basically just, allows people to experience and watch this loop, right? And this loop of animals and warriors and people and colors and flags. And that loop sort of is infinite, right? So you're watching this loop kind of return to the beginning again and again and again. And I think there's something to that. To me, there's something to the idea of an endless and repeating stream of images that the arcades are playing with, and the carousel, the spinning loop of animals and people is kind of a perfect metaphor for that. And it makes me wonder and think a lot about sort of what is this impulse? Why are we as humans creating this circle? Because the carousel continues, right? I mean, many of you know that carousels become, I think all of you know that carousels or merry-go-rounds become steam powered mechanical amusement park rides in the 19th century. And you can see merry-go-rounds pretty much everywhere. In fact, there was a merry-go-round in my hometown in the harbor that's been there for like 50 years. They took it out because they're gentrifying the place and want to turn it into a craft brewery with foosball tables. I'm not kidding you. But speaking of physical space, they took the merry-go-round out, and there was kind of a public outcry, and people were upset. There was kind of a lot of nostalgia placed on that merry-go-round. And ultimately, there was a campaign, probably a GoFundMe, to rescue the merry-go-round. They ended up putting it in the mall. So now that old carnival carousel is in the mall. But either way, I think the carousel is important to us as a symbol, and this kind of heritage of it coming from places of gathering, where you're sort of looking at the world pass you by in a loop, is something that gives it its certain power. So that loop, or that idea of a central circle where you're kind of gathering around, continues in another important piece of understanding the heritage and history of where amusement parks come from, is understanding these pleasure gardens, many of which again are European phenomenon. And of course, Disneyland itself looks like a European city. So it's important to recognize where this is coming from too. But either way, these pleasure gardens, like the ones we're looking at now, where you have this sort of places where circles or carousels or merry-go-rounds are central nodal points where people are moving in a circle around it or looking at a particular thing in the center of the circle. The Canaletto here is a pretty famous example of that. I mean, there are countless examples, and there's something important about this notion to me of a public space being a place that has a loop to it. Because to me, the loop is infinity, right? And the loop is caught in the timelessness. And it seems to be maybe a subconscious, maybe a conscious effort to create a physical metaphor for timelessness, or the timelessness of being in modern life and modern capitalism. So, again, pleasure gardens, places that are essentially like Central Park in New York City. They're curated, cultivated places that are meant to sort of be nature. At the same time, they're binding nature, and they're constructing things in nature. They're kind of an arena of nature. And I would argue that these circular these circular sort of park phenomenon that I'm locating here, I would say this is part of the Arcades project. This is part of a notion of being in a timeless, crowded zone and losing your ego in that zone is part of the point. It links up with psychedelic drugs, and I think we'll experience that with Disney as well. So you have these pleasure gardens and these parks that are playing with these principles throughout the 19th century. But I want to think about Disney, and again, we'll be returning to Disneyland, I think, quite a bit on Brick and Mortar, because the history of Disneyland and Walt Disney in particular is a place to think about Marxism in a very broad way, but also just for me, like all the things that I think about in terms of American history and culture and what it all means. Somehow it all exists at Disneyland, and that's partly maybe a nostalgia trap for me because I grew up going to Disneyland, but it's also to me, there's something incredibly powerful about what Walt Disney tapped into in the 20th century that we are still dealing with. And it should be noted that Walter Benjamin himself admired Mickey Mouse, thought that Mickey Mouse was a really important, powerful icon. So I'm not the only one here thinking that Disney is kind of a key figure in cracking the code of how the 20th century works and what its spell is still unfolding for us. So there's Disney looking good at a young age. By the 1940s, Walt Disney is a preeminent animator, the head of a really powerful motion picture studio. He is connected to the American government through the experience of World War II and fighting communism after World War II. So in the 1940s, Walt Disney is in a very, very powerful position. And he begins to think about creating what becomes Disneyland in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He's thinking about creating an amusement park. And there are a lot of different strands that come together in Disney's mind to craft what is ultimately going to become Disneyland, including, I think, most prominently, his experience with World's Fairs. So we'll think about World's Fairs in Brick and Mortar in another episode. But I want to think about this sort of legendary moment in Disney's life here when he goes to the Griffith Park in Los Angeles in the early 1950s and first thinks of Disneyland, because this is a legendary mythological moment, and it links up precisely with this idea of the carousel or the timeless loop. When Disney goes to Griffith Park in LA, a place that's sort of, you know, an icon and famous for its own reasons of an icon of what Los Angeles is and the movies, etc. But Disney takes his daughters there. He hangs out on a bench and he looks at his daughters playing on the Griffith Park carousel, and there it is, the famous Griffith Park carousel that is in part famous now as the inspiration for Disneyland. Walt Disney allegedly, as he narrates it, had the epiphany while he's watching his daughters there. And this is a quote from Walt Disney. He says, quote, "The idea for Disneyland came about when my daughters were very young, and Saturday was always Daddy's day with the two daughters. And as I'd sit on a bench while they rode the merry-go-round, I felt that there should be something built where the parents and the children could have fun together. So that's how Disneyland started. It all started from a daddy with two daughters, wondering where he could take them, where he could have a little fun with them too." So the suturing of the family is, I think, a theme here as well, as Disney is sitting on this bench, looking at his daughters streaming by on this constant loop again and again and again. He's thinking to himself, how can I implicate adults in this as well? How can I turn the smile of my daughters into a smile that's on everyone's faces? That's the impulse behind Disneyland. And you can even, at Disneyland, they have the exact bench where Walt Disney allegedly had this epiphany. And they even have, as you can see, a piece of a carousel there. So even if this is subconscious, Disney is engaging that principle of the carousel or merry-go-round or the timeless loop as something that's important to the whole project of building Disneyland. And when he makes his speech on the opening day, July 17th, 1955, Disney delivers a speech, and there's a piece of it that's on a plaque here next to this bench that tells you the whole idea of Disneyland. And listen to what Disney says. It is a place that has something to do with time. Here's Walt Disney in 1955. "To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land. Here, age relives fond memories of the past, and here, youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future. Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America, with the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world." So there's a lot going on there, including the cultural imperialism of thinking America is going to be the inspiration of the world. There's a lot happening there in terms of post-war American Cold War culture, quite honestly. However, the idea of time there, the idea that that older people come and relive the memories of the past, and young people come to be inspired about the future, and Disneyland is the place where we all sort of stand in the center of the circle and watch the whole loop go by of time. That's something that I think is key. What Disney is sort of condensing down into this into one physical place is the loop, the carousel, the merry-go-round, the arcade, the place where we lose ourselves, where we forget that we are subjects of capitalism, and we experience just the pure pleasure of that. There are ironies upon ironies in here, and this is why I sort of mentioned dialectics when I think about Disney, because Disney is in many ways condensing the horrors and pleasures of capitalism all in one physical place, and that is a trippy idea. So I want to return here now, and of course, yeah, when Disneyland is created, we have the giant, beautiful Disneyland carousel as a central, the merry-go-round as a central feature of the place, and that could not make any more sense, honestly, to me. So, coming back to our world in the 21st century, we've got these phones that we scroll through. It's difficult not to see the endless scroll of your timeline on Twitter or Facebook or whatever as a merry-go-round, as a thing that you sort of spin through. It endlessly refreshes, and it kind of always comes back to the beginning. There's never an end to it. It's not a linear track. So what I'm saying is, whether it be suburbs or shopping malls or the television set or your timeline on your phone, all of it is putting you in the position of being outside of time. There's a deep desire there, and capitalism, I think, has become almost too good at condensing that desire and delivering it to us, basically, drugging us, taking us out of the world with the physical environment of the world in front of us. It's a trippy idea, and it's one that, again, this writer, Apurva Tadapalli, in Real Life magazine, read this piece. For you theory heads out there, there's a lot more to it, but I want to end maybe with a little bit from her piece on Benjamin's Arcades project, thinking about Mark Zuckerberg and the metaverse, thinking about the idea of capitalism trying very hard to craft new arcades for us and condense the Arcades project into the principles of the Arcades project into consumer items and pieces of technology that deliver that to us. It's frightening. So here's a little bit again from Real Life magazine. In the glass interiors of the arcades, objects were transformed into commodities. And so the flaneur was transformed into a consumer and simultaneously a product for consumers. Idleness and leisure were transformed into economic work. The internet, like the arcades, feels like a city, a world in miniature. It feels like there is a transfer of capital with every interaction. Social media creates its own kind of flannery, where our internet personas are defined by the products and ideas that we consume or present ourselves as consuming. Life on social media is an endless window shopping trip through the arcades of simultaneously curating our own taste and observing others doing the same. Like the flaneur, we are only as valuable as we are visible. The cyber flaneur is the man of the crowd online, loitering, but making use value out of the image of leisure and creating what Baudelaire called the cult of oneself. Online, as in the arcades, the line between product and experience, profession and personality blurs, and we are all somewhat in the business of selling leisure. By making our consumption public, we are turning what Reddit users call Slack into economic output. Slack is, in its technical term, a natural hybrid of leisure and work. The two are, by definition, inextricable from each other. The online slacker is the embodiment of simultaneous production and consumption, and Benjamin's flaneur observer in the arcades is her ancestor. So that's a really great piece. It made me think a lot, and it made me think a lot about sort of connecting online culture to what Benjamin is talking about in the arcade. So go check that out. This what I admire, I think, about Walter Benjamin and his work is he's trying to like do this like meta theory of everything. Every sentence of his tries to sort of contain the entire history of the universe. And when you start to think about the carousel and the principle of the endless loop, and why this is coming out of us, why we've created built environments that make these loops for us and put us in this timelessness. It's hard not to think about the and get real trippy with these ideas, honestly, and think about like the makeup of cells and atoms, and the idea of a nucleus being surrounded and orbited by electrons and protons and neutrons. It's difficult then not to connect the carousel to the entire structure of the fucking solar system and universe, with the sun and us on this endless loop around the sun. We're on a planet itself that is an endless loop, with a new day every day. We're on the carousel. We're creating carousels. We are sort of subjected to this endless loop. And it's something that I think you can see it all at Disneyland. I mean, to be quite honest, Disneyland contains all of this. So we'll have much more to say about Disneyland in the future. Thanks for joining me on Trap TV.